Okay, will you cut the lights, please? Okay, my name is Ko, and I would like you to take a moment and watch this video. It only takes a minute. Thank you. I can have the lights now. Okay, so gotta get rid of this. And we'll start with these guys. Where do you go? I'll never go without a flashlight again. The truth is out about Coco. Yeah, the video was actually edited by Coco's trainers, but the impact is really great because as humans, we have no idea of what nature thinks. And as humans, we're so comfortable with, well, that wasn't supposed to move. Did I move it backwards? Okay. With the idea that we're the only things that that only we feel things, and that video has such a big impression. In this culture, it might be difficult to just to listen to other people, but it's not a usual practice to listen to the other species. And now our human survival depends on us listening to animals and nature. So how does one listen to a little critter that doesn't have ears and doesn't read the books about how it's supposed to behave? They have a real keen sense of smell, and they communicate by hormones. So when somebody's drunk or angry and they approach a hive, the bees are going to sense that. You don't want to be that person. You can smell their fear, they can smell yours, and you know who will get stung. And I don't know why this is hopping about. That wasn't supposed to happen. So we'll let it hop. Anyway, on the other hand, the bees are sensitive to the emotions of love and goodwill. And lately, the bees are very good at dying, and that's caused our attention. School children now know more about bees than they did 10 years ago. I've been presenting to 4-H classes, and the children have really gotten smart about bees. And a lot of study has gone into understanding about bees, raping bees, feeding them fake food, making them perform in laboratory boxes, and even little tiny robots to take their jobs. Some of it has been useful. For instance, now we know that the bees need 8 hours of sleep a day, or else they forget what they're doing, or they don't have enough energy to do what they need to do, and they nap on the job. Sound familiar? They also need to drink water, and they need high protein, but of course they're attracted to sugary drinks. Sound familiar? And bees' neurons are damaged by neonicotinoid pesticides, such that when they go out to forage, they forget the way home, or they forget where that great patch of fodder was. And we know that these pesticides also inhibit what bees can learn and their attention span. Sound familiar? So being 78% of the human genome, when bees die off, we really have to be aware and pay attention not only to about what plants aren't getting pollinated, but the agent that is killing those bees are also affecting you and me. especially children in the womb and babies. And Scheherazade, the legendary author of Arabian Nights, taught us the crime of chronic toxicity, where an author, in her story, has put poison on the lower page of every page of a book that an author has written who wants revenge. He knows his victim is going to lick his finger to turn each page. And by the time the person is finished with the book, he's dead. This kind of chronic toxicity happens when pesticides are built into honeycombs and in the food that feeds the larva at the most sensitive developmental time. It is not the acute one-time toxic exposure to a single adult bee that is used to determine whether a product is poison that can be used around our children or our bees. And I think now most people across society are beginning to realize there is a connection between pesticides and our children, although it's very seldom spoken, especially when you talk about bee death. It should be right there up there. So, did you know, this is a thing that's going to bounce around. I don't like that. But there's a picture in here. Maybe I have to be in control of it. So the bees evolved about 5 million years ago during the Cambrian, and I might have the wrong number in front of all those zeros, but it was a long time ago. And the last time carbon dioxide, that was the last time that the carbon dioxide was over 440 parts per million. And with all that carbon dioxide, it made the plants grow tall and leafy and not give a lot of attention to pollen or flowers. So the bees engineered wax comb to store and ferment pollen to break down the hard coating so that they could feed the protein to their offspring, and to dehydrate the sugary nectar and concentrate it into the energy-rich carbohydrate we call honey. When we taste honey, we're actually tasting the memory of those times. And think about it. This is the lesson the bees are trying to tell us. So I'm going to just give you some historical context here. If this will stop moving.
You take it off the slideshow.
I don't have it on slideshow. I don't think I do anyway. I don't want to fuss with it. So about 30,000 years ago, humans showed up and started stealing honey. It's our nature. We steal things. And the Egyptians, were this image, these images, they started figuring out how to move bees into cylindrical hives. And they built these hives in walls like this, and it kept the elephants out of their gardens. And one of the things, when they made this discovery, the African farmers who have trouble with elephants started putting beehives around their fences, and it keeps the bees out. So I love that, a little aside. Anyway, so what happened is when they got the bees to move into the cylinders, they were able to put the cylinders on boats and introduce migratory beekeeping. So the Egyptians were the first people that really did beekeeping. And this knowledge moved out of Egypt into Crete and Israel, and actually those mushed ones down here. Oops. These are Israeli hives. But in Crete, they started cooking them. It's a little more human thing, so they actually baked them. And then you come up with those cylinders there. So the hives are becoming more a part of husbandry, and a part of the culture, and a part of the spirituality. And we have the Melissae, which are the goddesses that took care of the oracle. And the Melissae, the princess, went to Greece and introduced beekeeping. And she also introduced the oracle. And you can see this oracle. Can we turn, I don't know if I can we hit this this is one of my favorite parts. Can we turn out the lights for a second? Now I'm just going to push this thing around. Yeah, so these are the Minoan Melesse, and this is the oracle where the Delphi in Greece kept the bees, and these ladies waited on the bees, and there's an image of that hive or that skep on top of Aphrodite. So we had a very feminized agricultural pastoral reality at that time. And then evidently the guys didn't like what some of the bees were saying to through the oracle. And they came up with Aristaces or something. And he became the god of beekeepers, and beekeeping became an industry and in service to the church. This is the bottom of the skep looking up. And they made wax for the church candles. The Lord would get the honey, and then the peasants would get the mead, and the bees, of course, would die. And this went on until about the 1700s, when the scientific thought started really looking at bees, and they put them in boxes because it made it easier for the beekeeper. Now, at the time of Aristaces, or whatever his name was, that guy, they decided that the big queen in the middle of the hive was a king bee. And it wasn't until the 1700s or the 1800s that they really realized that the queen bee's laying eggs and she's a female. So we can turn the lights on again. This is my bee garden, one of them. I replaced the front yard at my mom's house, and I use 1/5 the water and feed the bees most of the time. So what happened is the early European arrivals brought the bees to the USA or brought to the Americas. And after, it wasn't until the 1850s until the bees actually survived the trip around, around the Isthmus of Panama and up the coast. And in only 30 years, it transformed California into a garden from ranching, hunting, and trapping. That's the only way people could get food. The food wasn't growing. If you were a Westerner, there's lots of food for the Californians. But the missionaries didn't know how to grow it. Nothing would grow because there was nothing to pollinate it. So life was sweet for a while in California. And then after the World War II, the chemical companies had all these chemicals left over from the war, and they began to put these chemicals on the homeland in agriculture. And Rachel Carson warned us. I thought it was 1958. He said it was 1952. And as the use of chemical treatments grew, the population of bees began to decline. And pests responded, of course, to these chemicals by becoming more resistant, and newer, more harsh chemicals were introduced. By the turn into the 20th century, the defoliants and excess chemicals from the Vietnam were being dumped on farms all over the world. And California experienced incredible insect infestation, and they put more chemicals on, and it really hurt all the bees, all bee populations. And it also allowed illegal immigrants such as the fire ant and the Argentine ant, the greater and lesser hive beetles, the varroa mites, and related vectors and bacteria to come into the California, or come into our bee populations. So humans responded to this. Chemical companies chemical companies sponsored universities to develop new chemicals. Beekeepers started just doing anything crazy to keep the bees alive. Popular culture rallied to save the bees. And then when the honeybeam genome was completed in 2006, research on the bees really took off. That's when we found out how much alike we are. And in Europe, where beekeeping was done on a smaller scale, the connections between the chemicals and the bee deaths and human health was a little more apparent and led to the rejection of chemical treatments and pesticides. And the pesticide companies countered that by repressing that information as it came into the USA. I'd say it took 8 years before we started learning about the levels of toxicity that they knew in Europe in 2008. So banning that, the US companies are really clever. They said you have to reproduce all the experiments that were done in the EU. But they were able to gain a legislation that made it illegal to do any testing on their chemicals. So it took closer observation of bee behavior to reveal that all these mice, parasites, protozoa, all the pests were actually able to find refuge on the flower and jump from the flower to the bee, and even jump bee species at the flower. So there's clearly not enough flowers and too many bees, which kind of got me to the point, and this is how bees are lifelong learning. I realized that what I have to do is work on creating more floral abundance for the bees. Well, you don't get floral abundance if you don't have good soil health. So in the US, independent researchers, citizen scientists, and beekeepers began to come to these conclusions. You know, it's not rocket science. In 2016, a group called Bee Audacious in Marin sponsored a group of bee activists and scientists and agriculturalists to come together, and including Marla Spivak, University of Minnesota, Tom Seeley, who wrote Honeybee Democracy, which I recommend highly, and which sparked a new way of thinking about dealing with this crisis with the bees. And it was really significant because Marla was working for the University of Minnesota, and she was kind of supporting the industrial beekeepers. But in this conference, she really realized that we have to support all bees, native and honeybee, hobbyist bees in small populations, as well as agricultural bees. It really was a seminal type of experience for a lot of the people that were there. And the bees have been telling us that our agricultural practices are not survivable, and we're finally beginning to listen. And there's some important work that's being done on the East Coast. There's a man named Lambert Kanga. He's actually an African man who's teaching at University of Pennsylvania and also in Florida. And his team found there were important relationships between fungi and hive beetles and bee immune systems. And basically, too much fungus will kill the bees, but a little bit of fungus gives them an immunity against the beetles. In the last 2 years, the true nature of the varroa mite and its vectoring, yet another predatory bacteria, was discovered by the work of Sam Ramsey at the Van Ingelsdorf Bee Lab at the University of Maryland. That's yet to be published, but he was able to take electronic scanning photographs that actually showed how the bacteria was vectored and how the varroa attacks the bee. Until then, everyone was saying, oh, it's sucking the blood. It isn't. The varroa affects the liver, sucks out the liver of the bee by liquefying the liver, injecting the bacteria at the same time, then sucking the juice out. The bacteria affects the hemolymph, or the blood of the bees, and creates a really slow death. This is fantastic because my project is working with Barrett's group to grow the bacteria and see if our fungal library at the counterculture lab has some fungus in it that will attack the bacteria. And there's a lot of good news, just like everybody's been talking, and we need to pay attention to that. In the Philippines and Central America, people are, especially women, are rebuilding the stingless bee populations. We almost lost Bonella because they didn't know how that was pollinated. And there's a reintroduction and boosting bumblebee populations in England and France that's really significant. And all of this work implies that the regenerative and rehydrating methodologies in architecture, in agriculture, supports healthy bees. So once again, we come back to the soil, we come back to the climate. Soils Not Oil, pollinator partnership, what's PAN? Pesticides Action Network. There's just so many groups. I work also with a group called Parents for a Safer Environment. They've got Orinda and Moraga to not use glyphosate on the school grounds and the parks. Oakland is still using glyphosate in the school grounds, people. Anyway, there's lots of ways that people can do something, and we need to do that. Marla Spivak said this quite clearly on her TED Talk. She said, let's plant some flowers, people. So we need to do that. If you walk around, you'll see that people are putting little bee gardens in their urban habitats. It saves water, and it feeds the bees, and you can watch the bee behavior. It's very interesting how the bee species interact. And so what we all need to do is to get out in nature and to connect with, listen really good. And we're going to hear some really amazing things. And my friend said, you probably shouldn't say this, but small group. But one time I was out there and a bee came up and she buzzed right by my ear. So I know it was the bee. And I'm going, and she goes, L'chaim. L'chaim is Hebrew for to live. And I'm like, oh my gosh. So, of course, you know, being the human fool, I go, what? I couldn't believe it, but it was clearly L'chaim. And so, to life. And I brought some seeds. If you want to take some seeds, I hope you will plant them. And any questions? Beekeepers are dangerous. Once we start talking, hard to get us to stop. I'm giving you I think this is the little bee that came up and talked to me.
Do you have any understanding about bees, like, as we see our temperatures warm, are they affected by the temperature changes, like it's warming up? It's not getting cold, but it's warming up. Are they okay on the warmer side?
Well,
than what they're accustomed to, say, like the same area?
They have been around.
Do they have a range?
I mean, this is where they came from. This is what the whole reason that we even have honey is because the bees were making so much honey to keep themselves alive with that in those times where the honey was the nectar wasn't that sweet. But we get they're overworking. They're working doubly hard to fill up enough larder. And then the oxygen levels came up, but they still had that genetic memory that caused them to bring honey. So we've been getting honey for eons. Thank you, bees. Yeah. Right? Last year I harvested honey, but the 4 years before that, they made honey. They kept their brood alive. They didn't give anything for the beekeeper. And this year, half of my hives they're all doing well. Half of them are going to give me a little honey. Half of them, they're just taking care of themselves. So people are worried about saving the bees. The bees are going to take care of themselves. It's the humans that haven't been through this experience.
Okay. So do you think that they can survive different kind of conditions much better than us?
Yes, if we don't make the environment totally toxic and unavailable.
In the insect world, when the temperature warms up, their metabolism is just faster, so that would explain why they would be using more food for themselves.
Yes.
And leaving less in the hive.
But also, the hive is you've heard the brain the hive is a brain. It's an organism, a superorganism. That brain functions best at 96.5. Yeah. They are very close to humans. So, if it gets too hot, they will stop.
That heat would have to get like 110 or more.
Like for us, it would be uncomfortable.
Yeah, and what do you do? What do you do when it's really hot? You just worry about staying cool.
Right.
You don't work.
Yeah, you slow down.
So the bee, just think of yourself as a bee, and think about how we can create a clean environment for our grandchildren and for the unborn. I mean, talking about right to life, let's have right to life not be toxic, not be poisoned. And for the children especially, because when I just learned some interesting stuff about beekeeping in Japan, and where they use 50 times what they use in Europe in neonicotinoids on the field. We only use 10 times more than they allowed in Europe before they banned it completely. And they're going, we had Minamato, right? They had that lead poisoning disease. They know about the children and the babies being the most vulnerable population. And they are freaked because the ADHD or whatever that alphabet soup is on the rise in Japan too.
Yeah.
So it's
I heard it was really high.
yes, think locally, go global. We all have to do that. I mean, I guess I'm going to have to give up sushi, unless it's that organic California-grown rice from the Lundberg brothers. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Thank you very much.